All right, today we're diving into a pretty big controversy that's been brewing inside the National Association of Realtors. We've got some documents here from a member group called Packed Up, and they raise a really fundamental question. What happens when a profession's core ethics seem to go head-to-head with its political spending?
So at the very center of this whole story is something called Article 10. Now this is basically the ethical bedrock of the entire real estate profession. It's a promise of fairness and equality for everyone. You're going to want to keep this standard in mind, because everything we're about to look at is measured against it.
And that brings us right to the central question that these source materials are asking. What happens when that core promise of fairness seems to directly clash with the association's political activities?
Section 1, a promise of fairness. Okay, so let's start right there, with that promise. Like we said, according to these sources, Article 10 is the standard. But the very first conflict they point out has to do with how the association's political money is even collected in the first place.
Section 2, voluntary donations or hidden traps. So here's the thing, are the donations that fund all these political activities really voluntary? Because the sources we're looking at raise some pretty serious questions about that.
Okay, so the official stance is pretty clear. They say that all contributions to the Realtor Political Action Committee, you'll hear it called RPAC, are 100% voluntary. But the sources we're looking at, they paint a very different picture. They claim that when it's time for members to renew their annual dues, the forms often have these pre-checked donation boxes. So what's supposed to be a choice becomes more of an opt-out trap that a lot of members frankly don't even notice.
And it doesn't stop there. The documents also point to another tactic they call coercive. Get this, forcing members to donate to the PAC as a fine, say, if their phone rings in a class. The sources claim this practice actually violates federal law.
Okay, so that's how some of the money is collected, at least according to these documents. But that leads to the next big question. Where does all that money actually go? And this is where we get into the next layer of claims from the source material.
Well, the sources claim there's a serious lack of transparency here. They really zero in on one organization in particular, called the American Property Owners Alliance, or APOA. They describe it as this kind of secretive nonprofit that, honestly, most realtors have probably never even heard of.
And we're not talking about small change. The packed-up documents allege that nearly $10 million in member dues were secretly funneled through this very organization to partisan groups with agendas that the sources say are way outside the scope of housing.
Section 3, property rights or culture wars. And this, of course, raises a really key question that the sources keep coming back to. Is this spending really about protecting property rights, or is it about funding culture wars?
So if you look at the official sales pitch, the rationale for APOs seems pretty simple. Its stated mission is to advocate for property rights, which, is a core issue for every single realtor.
But the sources say that when you actually follow the money, a whole different story starts to emerge. They allege that APOA's funds are actually going to groups fighting these big culture war battles. Things like campaigns against critical race theory, efforts to restrict abortion rights, and opposition to LGBTQ+ protections. And the argument from the sources is that these issues have no direct link to housing at all. And this example perfectly illustrates the central debate we're talking about. You have one side saying, hey, LGBTQ rights are a social issue. We only focus on property rights. And then you have the other side firing back. No, wait a minute. Attacking something like marriage equality is an attack on core property rights.
So the sources actually break down their logic here step by step. They argue that legal marriage is absolutely fundamental to how property is owned. Think about it. Before marriage, spouses have legal claims to assets. During marriage, you've got joint ownership and financing protections. And after death, spousal inheritance rights are completely tied to legal marriage. So to them, it's not a social issue at all. It's a core property issue, plain and simple.
Section 4, neutral politics or partisan plays. Okay, so it's not just about where the money goes. The sources also challenge the whole idea that the political endorsement process is neutral.
Okay, so here's one of the big myths the sources point to. It's the idea that the PAC, RPAC, is a legally separate entity from the association itself. And because of that, well, it doesn't have to follow the code of ethics.
But according to the sources, that just doesn't hold water. They argue the PAC is completely inseparable from the association. I mean, it's run by realtors, in realtors' offices, and it dominates everything from dues renewals to meetings and conferences.
All right, here's another myth they tackle, the friendly incumbent rule. The idea is simple. If a politician supported real estate issues before, then the association supports them again. Sounds logical, right? Well, the sources claim this so-called rule isn't actually written down anywhere. They say it's basically an inconsistent excuse that gets pulled out to justify endorsing candidates who might be, let's say, anti-diversity, even when their platforms seem to directly contradict Article 10.
And how about this one? The idea that national doesn't control endorsements, the local committee does. Basically, the argument is that the National Association isn't responsible because these decisions are all made at the state and local level.
But here's the fact, according to the sources, National RPAC actually holds veto power. So, by not vetoing an endorsement of a candidate with an anti-diversity platform, their silence, they argue, is the same thing as an endorsement.
Section 5. The call for accountability. So after laying all of this out, what's the conclusion? Well, the source documents issue a very direct call for accountability.
Their call to action really boils down to 3 clear steps. Step 1. Demand full transparency. They want every single dollar spent by RPAC and APOA to be visible to all members. Step 2. Enforce Article 10 times everywhere. The ethical code has to apply to political endorsements, not just real estate deals. And Step 3. End what they call the hidden traps. Stop using things like pre-checked boxes and mandatory fees for political fundraising.
And all of this leaves us with the one huge question that these documents pose for the entire profession. When a group's ethics and its politics collide, which one is supposed to give way? It's a really powerful question to think about.